Hi, everyone. Welcome to We3Live, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Erin Otan with Z Prime, and I'm joined today by Sage McLaughlin, the Director of Transportation Electrification at Edison Energy. How are you doing today, Sage?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to talk to you. We're going to talk today about transportation electrification, particularly around fleet electrification. So I'm excited to kind of get into this conversation here. So could you just start us off with a brief intro of Edison Energy, what you do, what your role is there?
Yeah, Edison Energy is a global company that works to have a local impact. So we are energy consultants and sustainability consultants that work with folks to help them make really complex decisions. Most of the time, when you're talking about sustainability, people think of a sustainable world. You also have to think about those complex decisions of a sustainable business and equality and energy management. And so we work with folks in the commercial and industrial worlds to make sure that as they're trying to navigate these complex ideas, that we're helping them. More specifically in transportation electrification, which is the area I have the privilege of working in. We work with folks as they're figuring out how to electrify their fleet, which is extremely complex given just all of the wonderful moving parts involved in that. So I have the privilege of working with folks who have long industry experience in utilities or infrastructure or policy. And we find companies that are looking to make big impacts by being kind of the trailblazers of their space and figure out how to electrify their fleet first.
It sounds like a fun job that you get to do. So what are some of the most important aspects to prioritize when an organization is trying to transition their fleet to electric?
Yeah, I think having a strategy, thinking about where you're at today and where you want to be, but then turning it into an actionable plan and coming up with ideas of how are you going to pivot when opportunities arise. We see policy changing very quickly and incentives changing and becoming more available. So having a strategy and a plan is wonderful, but also coming up with how are you going to address change when it happens? Thinking about all the parties involved and what matters to them. When we're talking about vehicles, we're talking about safety and we're talking about operations. And so making sure you're thinking about what is that transition as we get there? And then what does day-to-day life look like in the end of it? So we look at not just a kind of rip and replace of fleets, but what does 3, 5, 10 years look like? What are the opportunities and where are the locations where you can make the biggest impact, both for your industry and your business, as well as the communities that are going to be impacted by it?
Yeah, so it sounds like a big undertaking, and you kind of mentioned considering all the different parties who are going to be involved. So can you expand on that a little bit? Like, who are the key stakeholders and partners that should be included? How do you communicate with them and bring them all together? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I would say historically, as you're thinking about fleets, you're thinking about fleet and facility managers. But when you're thinking about moving to electric vehicles or alternative fuels, now it's the fleets and the facilities, but it's also sustainability leadership and energy managers and procurement. We always say you want an executive there. Usually the executives are the ones who walk by the desk and say, hey, we should electrify our fleet by 2030 and then wander off. And so making sure we understand what is that driver. Is it coming from policies and incentives and wanting to be opportunistic? Is it coming from mandates and making sure you're compliant? Or is it coming from a place of, sustainability led through ESG reports? And so I think identifying what is pushing the industry or the company in that direction, making sure those stakeholders are there, but then also taking into consideration who are the people who are going to drive these vehicles? Who are the people who are going to charge these vehicles? What does day-to-day life look like at the end of this all when everything is perfect and wonderful? And then how are you going to address change throughout it? And so we identify those key stakeholders and then kind of help them navigate all of the changes that go into this, but also making sure that folks have a voice in it. And that comes back to what are the communities that you're going to impact? Are you doing public or private charging? Where do your vehicles currently run? And is that route going to change as you move forward? And as we think about that, who are the communities, and can we give them a voice in the room, because they're going to be impacted either by, lack of noise pollution, ideally emissions reductions, all of that area as well.
Just real quickly, you mentioned, maybe being driven by ESG goals. Is that something you're seeing more of these days? Is that something that's becoming more important and that's like actually driving fleet electrification for a lot of organizations?
I think so. We see it both from organizations wanting to do it, but we also see it from there is policy and there is money helping drive those kind of decisions to be made. So Biden has Justice 40, and that's really helping folks figure out some infrastructure and helping to impact those communities that have historically been disadvantaged by allotting, I think it's 40% of those grants towards disadvantaged communities. So I think there's folks who are adjacent or very close to those communities that can leverage those grants and can impact positively those communities. But I also think, there are companies that have these ESG reports and they're trying to figure out what is the social aspect of ESG and how can we make, the energy we consume, the way we operate and the way we work have a more impactful just legacy on the world that they're leaving behind. And so I think transportation electrification has a lot to do with environmental justice. I think companies see it, governments see it, and there's funds behind it. But I would say that's a big part of it. Sustainability, again, both from a sustainable world and a sustainable business, that's another huge driver from the cost, carbon, and kind of complex choices.
And then you talked a little bit about, maybe your routes might change or where you're going to be storing or charging things might change. And then even just for the drivers, like how they interact with their vehicles. So how important is change management when you're switching over an entire fleet?
So important. And it's funny because when you're rolling out a big program or a big project at any company, change management is always kind of a buzzword that you should talk about and you should think about. But when you're thinking about, all changing completely the way that a fleet works, it's so important. It comes down to, let's say you're going to do a one vehicle pilot. Well, how do you make sure that pilot is successful? How do you make sure that driver has a positive experience in the vehicle? Where do you put the charger? Because if you put the charger at the farthest corner of the parking lot, well, okay, now you've inserted kind of a barrier to success as that person has to walk all the way in. But as we talk about change management, it's thinking about what is the pilot, what are the operations, where does that go into? So who's going to be driving the vehicles, who's going to be charging them, and when do they need to be charged? If you have union employees, maybe you need to think about what those contracts look like in order to have them charge vehicles. You also have to think about the people who report on this. So whether it's, accounting departments or procurement departments or oversight, a lot of the incentives and policy and kind of we call bags of cash behind the movement towards transportation electrification, it has requirements of a lot of reporting and a lot of upkeeping. So who's going to be doing that as you continue on? I think coming through the experience of transitioning a fleet and identifying all those different variables, change management is super important because, like I said, it's not a rip and replace. You're impacting a number of people's day-to-day jobs. And so making sure you understand upfront, what is that cost benefit analysis? And then what does life look like at the end of the day when this is a raging success and everybody's doing it?
Yeah, and it seems like from the driver's perspective too, there's just a little bit of cultural difference and aspect when you're talking about like big gas powered vehicles versus electrified vehicles. So I don't know, what do you hear from drivers? Are they sort of excited about the change, or are they more worried about these kinds of things like, oh, how am I going to charge, or a little bit of both?
I would say it depends on the type of fleet and the size of the fleet. We've had the privilege of working with folks who are moving towards passenger vehicles being electrified. And so if you're working with like a pharmaceutical sales fleet, they're really thinking of safety. Am I charging at home or am I charging publicly? What are the luxury vehicles? Maybe vehicles are a perk of that kind of company. And so the types of things you think of with passenger vehicles are really different than what you would think of with like medium and heavy duty vehicles. Medium and heavy duty, yes, there's a lot of conversations about route optimization and charging and optimization of that charging. But there's also, safety and regenerative braking and, Tesla versus not Tesla when you're talking about the semis. And so I would say, at least in my experience, the drivers have been excited. It's fun to drive electric vehicles. We always talk about in energy, nobody likes to sit around and talk about their roof. Roofs are boring and getting solar on it is cool and awesome, but it's not like sexy. Vehicles are sexy. Vehicles are fun to talk about. So drivers buy in early usually.
Yeah. Could you maybe expand a little bit more on the differences between dealing with passenger vehicles and heavy duty vehicles? Like what are some of the differences when you're dealing with the different types of fleets?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about passenger vehicles, a big part of it is it going to be take home charging? And if you take home their vehicle, are they charging at home? How are companies navigating that? Is it an HR perk? Is it like a cell phone where they get reimbursed? What do you do when you see employee turnover when it comes to that charger in those vehicles? So having a strategy and coming up with HR policies and employment policies around kind of those take home vehicles is an area that we work with passenger vehicles a lot on. We also talk about the different types of passenger vehicles. We're seeing more and more come out, but do you want something that is new and shiny, or do you want something from a vehicle provider that's been around for a long time? Lots of folks are talking about coming from VHS into the streaming world. Do we know if we double down on DVDs or Blu-rays? And in the end of the day, it didn't matter. We're kind of going through that when it comes to electric vehicles and the chargers and the infrastructure. We're at the DVD Blu-ray world where we're getting to the streaming services. So when we talk about passenger vehicles, a lot of it is about where and when will you charge? How quickly will it happen? With those medium and heavy duty, it's more about infrastructure. You're bringing in the charging. Where is that energy coming from? What is the makeup of that energy? Are you going to do on-site renewables or energy storage? Are you going to rely on the grid? And is your utility going to be able to meet the timelines you need? So we work with a number of folks who either, we specialize a lot in the medium and heavy duty space. And we work with a lot of folks that are looking at how do I meet the timelines that I need either to serve my customers or my fleet? And how do I get the utility or the energy to back it?
And how important is the customer engagement side? Is that something that you guys work on Absolutely. When it comes to electrification?
Yeah, when it's all about the customer, whether the customer has the fleet or the customer is serving a fleet, it has to work for the people who it's going to work for. It's client driven first. So there are times, especially coming back to Justice 40 and environmental justice and kind of the vision around that, there are communities that if you involve them in the conversation, they don't want to have cars. They don't want to do this. So talking about bringing in additional chargers so they can charge their electric vehicles doesn't make the most sense. So how do we start talking about public transportation or other ways to get around? I think as we go forward, we think about all of these areas that are impacted. It has to be about the client, it has to be about the end users, and it has to be about the communities that are interacting with it. Electric vehicles are much quieter. So what does noise pollution look like today versus 10 years from now? Emissions, how do we get good air quality? Where are the highways running? Where is the charging infrastructure at? This is a really neat point in time because you're looking at a huge shift in an entire industry of transportation. And we really haven't seen anything like that since kind of the internet came out and energy had to be able to serve data centers. And we thought there's never going to be enough energy to serve all of the data centers. And then lo and behold, we're hearing that same thing. There's never going to be enough energy to serve all the vehicles. But every 20 years, we find a way and it happens. And so I think the key to doing that is finding a way where we put the communities first, we put the clients first, and we keep kind of the eye on the ball of what's important. And when it comes to vehicles, it's safety, it's operations, and it's keeping the lines running. We all felt the impact of logistical and supply chain timelines being impacted. There can't be a break in the system, but there does need to be a transition.
Yeah, and I know you recently wrote an article that people can check out, kind of more focused on this environmental justice piece. And then speaking a little bit more to that, you mentioned Justice 40. Are there impacts that you expect to see from other policy legislation like the IRA or the IIJA that are going to impact environmental justice?
Yes, I think we're just going to keep seeing change. There's a lot of folks who are trying to figure out how to make this work. Some of the policy is probably more intentionally ambiguous because we're trying to figure it out. But also keep in mind, we're coming up on election seasons and all of the things that happen with that. So I do think we're going to see more policy. I think we're going to see a lot more action taken at the state level. I also think cities are, doubling down and figuring out what they want their city to look and feel and act like. And so whether you're seeing incentives or mandates come through, it doesn't necessarily have to be from the federal government. It can be from the state departments of transportation. It can be from cities. I think we're going to see a lot more stuff come. I don't know if it will, all be clear and beautifully outlined, but I think having teams or having advisors or having folks who understand policy and kind of the nuance of it, it's worth the investment just because, like I said, there's a lot of opportunity out there to find ways to help finance infrastructure changes or chargers or whatever you need in order to make this happen. It can just be complex and you might only have to solve this problem once for the next 5 years, but it's worth solving it right or having an approach for, okay, what if a new incentive becomes available? How am I going to leverage that? Or what if mandates have to be budgeted in as we think about where and when we're going to make an impact?
One last question for you. What advice do you have for organizations that want to start electrifying their fleet, but might not know where to start or how to start?
Obviously, I would say call me, happy to help. But I think a big part of it is don't be afraid to act. A lot of people are saying, hey, maybe there's not a vehicle that'll work for my fleet, or that's not a goal of ours until 2045. But we know change takes time. And so I think coming up with a high level strategy and an immediate action plan early pays dividends. Identifying the areas that you want to have an impact, identifying what's most important to you and those areas that have maybe long lead time, having a strategy early and just kind of taking stock of where you sit today. It's never too early and you can pivot and you can change, but I think a lot of folks want to see that companies are moving in that direction and taking the time to have those conversations. So I would say it's never too early to start. And there's so many complex, amazing things at the table that at least bringing the folks together, you might be surprised at how innovative some teams can get.
Well, thank you so much. There's a lot to think about. I know these are big projects, but it's really exciting to see more and more big organizations starting to transition their fleets and decarbonize. And I'm looking forward to seeing, like you said, how they solve these challenges and how we have the energy to do it. So really appreciate your insights today. Thank you for joining us on WE3Live.
Thank you so much, Erin.
All right. Thank you everyone else for watching, and we will see you at our next WE3Live session.